Montana Territory, July 1877. The wagon wheel hit a deep rut in the dry, cracked trail just as the sun dropped low behind the Bitterroot Range. And that was the moment she lost her footing. Tessa Kellan barely had time to cry out before the world tilted and her body pitched backward off the side of the moving wagon. Her fingers scrambled for the edge of the seat, but the canvas frame slipped through her hands like water. Then arms, strong, steady, sure. She landed hard against a man's chest, the breath knocked clean from her lungs, dust rising in a halo around them as he dropped to his knees with her in his arms. "You all right?" His voice was low and rough, like gravel rubbed between palms. His face hovered above hers, framed by the sun, a wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow across his brow. "Can you move?" Tessa blinked, her heart thudding wild with shock. I think so." He helped her sit up slowly, his hand braced firm at her back, the other steadying her shoulder. "You are lucky I was riding close," he said, glancing toward the wagon now halted a few paces ahead. "You could have cracked your skull." Tessa brushed dust from her skirt with trembling fingers. "I did not see the rut." "I did." He stood, offered his hand. "Name's Ashford, Wynn." She took it and let him pull her to her feet. "Tessa Kellan," he nodded once. "You traveling alone?" "No." She turned and pointed to the wagon. "My father's up front." "He is hard of hearing, or he would have stopped sooner." Ashford looked toward the older man now climbing down from the driver's box. "He family?" "Yes. He is sick, though. Fever comes and goes. We are heading to Bozeman to find a doctor." Ashford's eyes tracked the wagon, then her face again. "That is a long way with a sick man and only one team pulling." "I know." He did not ask why they were alone. The answer hung between them, heavy and obvious. No mother, no brothers, no help. Just Tessa and her father and a wagon piled high with what little they could carry from their homestead. "I will ride with you till Bozeman," Ashford said suddenly. Tessa's eyes widened. "You do not have to do that." "I know I do not." He looked toward his horse, tethered just beyond the trail. "But I am going to." He did not wait for her thanks. Just tipped his hat and walked toward the animal, loosening the reins. That night, Ashford set up camp with them just off the trail. He helped unhitch the mules, gathered firewood, and kept a quiet watch while Tessa heated broth for her father. In the flicker of firelight, she stole glances at the man who had caught her from falling headfirst onto hard, packed earth. He was lean and sun-worn, his jaw covered in days of stubble, his voice quiet but never uncertain. When he spoke, it was with care. When he listened, he looked right at her. Her father, Charles, coughed rough into a cloth and dozed off shortly after supper. Tessa sat on her heels beside the pot, stirring the last of the beans with the back of a spoon. Ashford sat across from her, legs stretched out, hat tipped back on his head. "You always travel alone?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Used to ride with a herd, left Texas spring last year, been drifting since." A pause. "Sometimes it is easier not to stay too long anywhere." She studied his face. "But you are staying now." "For a few days," he said. Her lips curved slightly. "Why?" He looked at her steady. "Because you almost cracked your skull falling off a wagon." She smiled despite herself. "That is not a reason." "No," he said, voice quiet. "It is an excuse." The next morning, Ashford rode ahead to scout the trail. When he returned, he had news of a small river just a half-day's ride up. "We will need to camp there," he told her. "Give the mules rest. Let your father cool down in the water, might help the fever." Tessa nodded, grateful. "Thank you." That afternoon, she watched him from the driver's seat while he rode alongside the wagon. He rode like the horse was part of him, easy and sure. There was something in the way he moved, like he belonged to the land more than any town. When they reached the river, Ashford helped her lower her father from the wagon and carried him to the water's edge. He waded in with Charles cradled against him until the older man was submerged to the waist, groaning at the relief. Tessa stood at the bank, hands pressed together by her lips, watching. That night her father slept deeper than he had in days. Ashford sat beside her near the fire, watching the flames. "He will make it to Bozeman," Tessa nodded. "He said he wanted to see the mountains one more time." "That is why we left. You will stay in Bozeman," she hesitated. "I do not know. I have no husband, no brothers living. He is all I have." Ashford nodded slowly. "You are strong." She looked at him. "Why did you leave Texas?" His jaw shifted. "My brother and I ran a cattle ranch." "He died." A pause. "I sold it, did not see a reason to stay." Her eyes softened. "I am sorry." He gave a slight nod. "He was the one who talked, I just worked. And now," Ashford looked at her, really looked. "Now I am talking more than I used to." She smiled, heart caught in her throat. The next day the trail narrowed, winding through tall pines. Tessa walked beside the wagon, letting her father rest on the seat. Ashford rode ahead, his rifle across his back, eyes scanning the trees. Suddenly, the mules spooked. One kicked against the harness and the wagon jostled violently. Tessa's boot caught a rock and the world tilted again, but this time she did not fall. Ashford was already there, arms around her waist, steadying her. She looked up into his face, breathless. "You are always catching me," he smiled faintly. "You keep falling," she laughed, resting her hand against his chest. "Maybe I like it." His eyes darkened with something she had not seen before, not pity, not concern, something warmer, something that made her heart thump against her ribs. They reached Bozeman 2 days later. Ashford helped her carry her father into the doctor's house. He stayed at her side while the man was treated and watched as color slowly returned to Charles' face. That evening, Ashford stood beside her outside the small cabin the doctor offered them. The sun dipped low behind the hills. Tessa looked up at him. "Your horse is saddled," he nodded. "You are leaving?" Ashford looked at her for a long moment. "Unless you ask me to stay," she swallowed. "Why would I?" His voice was low. "Because I have not wanted to stay anywhere in over a year." "Until now." Her eyes searched his face. "You really mean that?" He nodded. "I caught you falling, Tessa, but you are the one who caught me." She stepped closer, her hand reaching for his. "Then stay." He did not say anything else. Just pulled her into his arms, held her close, and exhaled like a man who had finally found home. A week passed with the scent of pine and saddle soap lingering behind every breath. The town of Bozeman unfolded slow and spare, around them log storefronts leaning into dusty boardwalks, traders' wagons rattling through midday, and the tobacco-thick hush of men lingering outside the livery. It wasn't much, and certainly not what Tessa had expected to call home, but her father's health had steadied enough that she'd stopped checking his breath in the night. Ashford stayed, not with words or promises, but by the way his coat had found a nail inside the cabin door, by the way he rose before dawn to tend the mule team Charles insisted on keeping, and by how he stood behind her when she brought bread to the doctor's wife in thanks. He never asked for a place, but he fit into the seams of their days without needing to be folded in. That morning she found him splitting kindling behind the shed, sleeves rolled to the elbow, shirt clinging damp to his back in the rising heat. "I've been asked to help with the schoolhouse roof," she said, hands clasped behind her apron. "It leaks something awful. They've offered coin, but I think it's more about not wanting to climb ladders in skirts." Ashford set the axe aside, straightened. "You going to take it?" "I already did." She ran her toe through the dirt. "But I'd rather not go alone." He wiped his hands on a grain sack and nodded once. "I'll walk you." The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a squat one-room structure with a crooked stovepipe and flaking whitewash. A pair of boys scrambled past them on the path, stained fingers clutching sticks like rifles. Inside, it smelled of chalk and mice. Tessa climbed up to the rafters without hesitation, skirts tied at her knees, hammer in hand. Ashford stayed below, passing her nails as needed. "You ever teach?" "No," she said, balancing on the beam. "But I read every book I could get my hands on since I was small. My mother taught me before she passed." He watched her quietly, eyes following the sure movement of her hands. "You could teach if you wanted. I don't know if I'm the sort that children listen to." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You're the sort I listen to." She paused, startled, then laughed softly. "That's different. Don't see how." They walked back with the sun high above and the wind smelling faintly of sage. She carried her hammer tucked beneath her arm. Ashford walked close enough that their sleeves brushed now and then. "You ever think about settling?" she asked, not looking at him. "I've thought about it more lately." Tessa nodded. "I never thought I'd leave our farm, but once we did. I started wondering if I'd ever really belonged there." Ashford glanced toward her. "You belong where you're needed." She stopped, turned to face him fully. "And where do you belong?" He reached up, brushed a fleck of sawdust from her brow with rough fingers. "Still figuring that out." Later that evening, she found her father sorting through crates behind the cabin, thumbing through a tattered ledger. His voice was rasped from sleep. "Is he still here because of me?" Tessa shook her head. "No. He's here because he wants to be." Charles watched her carefully. "You trust him?" She didn't answer right away. "I do." He nodded, then folded the ledger closed. "Then that's enough." When the wind rose that night, it came in sudden and dry, rattling the shutters and lifting dirt into the eaves. Ashford didn't sleep inside, yet he'd set up a canvas lean-to beside the barn. But when the storm rose sharp enough to scatter loose shingles, Tessa found herself stepping barefoot into the yard, shawl clutched tight. He sat upright, pulling on his boots before she even reached him. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "The wind woke me." He looked toward the western sky where lightning crept silently beneath the clouds. "It'll pass." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Will you come in?" Ashford met her eyes. "You sure?" She nodded once. Inside, she laid a blanket near the hearth. He didn't ask for more. Just removed his boots, set them beside hers, and lay down with his hat over his face. She watched the firelight catch the curve of his jaw before returning to her room. In the morning, she found him already gone to the fields, mending the fence line where a rail had split. She brought him bread and coffee in a tin mug, and they sat shoulder to shoulder on the grass, the dew still clinging to her hem. "I think I could stay here," he said after a while, eyes on the mountains. She didn't move. "What changed your mind?" His thumb brushed the rim of the mug. "Nothing changed. I just stopped running." She looked at him, quiet. "And if I asked you not to go?" He turned toward her, the line of his mouth softening. "Then I won't." She reached for his hand and didn't let go. The hayloft above the livery was hotter than a stovepipe by midday, but Ashford didn't mind the sweat. He moved with quiet rhythm, stacking the final bales along the far wall while the owner, a square-shouldered man named Emery, counted feed sacks below. When the last coil of hay was wedged into place, Ashford climbed down the ladder and dusted off his hands. "You're quicker than most," Emery said, eyeing the neat rows. "Don't suppose you're looking for steady work." Ashford tugged his sleeves down and set his hat back on. "Maybe." Emery scratched his jaw. "I'll be needing another hand come fall. Most drift off after roundup, but you look like you've put down a root or two." Ashford gave a simple nod. "I'll think on it." He walked out into the glare of the sun, boots crunching dry ground, and headed toward the general store where Tessa said she'd be helping inventory new goods. The walk was short, but the air was heavy, and his shirt stuck to his spine by the time he reached the back porch where crates had been left under canvas. He spotted her kneeling beside a box marked with freight stamps. Ledger balanced on her knee. She didn't look up. More sacks of flour than we ordered, and someone added 2 bolts of blue muslin I didn't ask for. He leaned against the post. Could be a mistake. Could be Mrs. O'Shaughnessy trying to get me to sew her daughter another church dress. Ashford smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes softening. You going to? I haven't decided yet. She made a note in the ledger, then glanced at him. Did you come from the livery? Finished the loft. Emery offered me a job, her brow lifted. Are you going to take it? Depends. On what? Ashford looked down at her hands, ink smudged on her knuckles. Whether you want me to stay that long. Tessa didn't answer right away. She closed the ledger, set it aside, and stood. I don't want to make that choice for you. You wouldn't be. She met his eyes. Then yes, I want you to stay. That night, Charles sat on the stoop, a blanket across his legs, pipe cradled in one hand though it hadn't been lit. Tessa brought out a plate of cold cornbread and molasses, set it beside him, and took a seat on the step below. Ashford remained standing near the post, arms folded. You ever think about building your own place? Charles asked, voice scratchy from the evening chill. Ashford tilted his head. Once. A long time ago. Well, Charles said, tapping the pipe against his knee, ain't too late for a man to change his thoughts. Tessa glanced back at Ashford, but he was already looking at her. Later, when the lamp was trimmed low and the wind had gone still, Ashford lingered near the barn. Tessa joined him without a word, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. You ever miss Texas? She asked. He rubbed a thumb along the curve of his palm. I miss what it used to be. My brother had a way of making it feel like it mattered. She stepped closer, her voice quiet. And now I feel like I matter here. She reached out, took his hand, and didn't let go. They walked the edge of the pasture as dusk settled in, the horizon glowing faint behind the ridge. Crickets stirred beneath the grass, and somewhere down in the hollow, a nighthawk called once, then again. Ashford stopped beside the old fence line, boards warped from years of weather. If I built something, he said, it'd be right here. Tessa turned to face him. What would it look like? 2 rooms. A porch, enough space for a wood stove and a table under the window. And a place to hang your coat, he nodded, brushing her wrist with the back of his hand. A place for your books. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. You think of all that already? I've been thinking about it since the day I caught you. Tessa looked up at him, and for the first time there was no caution in her eyes, just warmth and trust, and something steady enough to build from. She stepped into his arms, and he held her like he'd been waiting his whole life to. When they returned to the cabin, Charles was asleep, the lamp burning low beside his chair. Ashford didn't say a word, just followed Tessa inside, boots in hand, and closed the door behind them. In the days that followed, the land began to shift. The wheat fields west of town turned gold, and children returned to the schoolhouse with slates and bare feet. Ashford worked the livery by morning and helped Tessa mark out a patch of ground behind the cabin by evening. They built with their own hands. He laid the foundation, she sawed planks. He raised the frame, she drove nails. When it was done, it wasn't grand, but it was theirs. And when he hung his hat on the nail by the door, he didn't take it down again, not because she asked, but because he finally had a reason to stay. By late August, the scent of cut hay lingered in the still air, and the hills east of town had begun to pale at the edges, the green gone dry and brittle. Tessa stood barefoot in the doorway of the new cabin, a basket of late beans nestled in the crook of her arm. She watched Ashford finish hitching the wagon, his shirt damp at the collar, jaw set against the sun. We'll need to bring back hinges, she said as he turned toward her. The pantry door won't close right. Ashford pulled the brim of his hat lower against the glare. There's a smithy now down past the gristmill. I'll see if he's got any decent ones." Tessa nodded and stepped down from the porch. "I'll go with you." They rode into town slow, the wagon rattling gently along the rutted road. A pair of mourning doves flitted across the path ahead, their wings catching in the sun. Ashford kept one hand on the reins, the other resting loose over his thigh. Tessa sat close, her skirts brushing against his leg with every jostle. They passed the church, where someone had painted the trim a pale blue, and the mercantile, where a girl no older than 12 swept dust from the steps with the hem of her apron. At the smithy, the air was thick with smoke and iron. Ashford hopped down first, then offered his hand to help her from the seat. Inside, the heat pressed in thick, and the clang of hammer on metal echoed off the walls. Ashford spoke with the blacksmith, a broad man with arms like fence rails, while Tessa wandered toward a bench where hinges and latches were laid out in rows, some rusted, some new forged. Ashford joined her, eyes scanning the piles. "These'll hold." She picked up a pair, the metal still warm. "Do you miss working with cattle?" He paused, then shook his head. "I miss the sound more than the work. Night herds lowing across open land, but not the dust in my teeth." Tessa smiled gently. "I sometimes miss the quiet of our old place. Before it all got so hard. You ever think of going back?" She looked up at him steady. "No." They paid in coin and left with the hinges wrapped in burlap. As they climbed back into the wagon, the blacksmith called after them, "You buildin' a place, Wynn?" Ashford glanced over his shoulder. "Built." The smith gave a slow nod, then turned back to his forge. On the ride home, the light shifted, thickening as clouds gathered low over the hills. Tessa reached into the basket at her feet and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in linen. She handed it to Ashford. He looked down at it, brow lifted. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a pair of hand-stitched gloves, the leather worn soft, the seams tight. He turned them over in his hands. "You made these?" "I had needle time while you finished the fence last week." He slipped them on without a word, flexed his fingers. "Fit perfect." Tessa folded her hands in her lap. "I wanted you to have something that would last." Ashford looked at her, his voice quiet. "I don't plan on wearing them anywhere but here." That evening, the wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the yard. Ashford worked beneath the eaves, fitting the new hinges while Tessa shelled beans beside the stove. Inside, the walls smelled of cedar and hearth smoke. The shelves were half filled with jars and folded linens, and the floorboards creaked only slightly when walked across. After supper, Tessa stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed against the breeze. Ashford joined her, his jacket unbuttoned, the gloves tucked into his belt. She looked toward the pasture. "A woman from the school board stopped me after church, said they need someone to teach reading through the winter. You'll take it," she nodded, "if I can still help out here." Ashford leaned against the post beside her. "This place is ours. You decide what it needs." She turned to him, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "And what about you?" "I've taken Emery's offer. He wants me year-round." Tessa's eyes softened. "You didn't say." "I wanted to be sure first." "Sure of what?" "That you wanted me here longer than the harvest." She stepped close enough to rest her hand over his chest. "I want you here for every season." Ashford reached up, covered her hand with his. "Then I'll never leave." They stood there until the sky darkened into a deep blue hush, the porch boards cool beneath their feet, and the wind carrying the scent of something new, something that felt like a beginning, not an ending. September brought a brittle edge to the mornings. Ashford rose early, pulling on his coat without waking Tessa, and stepped outside into air that smelled faintly of frost. The fields beyond the barn lay quiet, the tall grass bowed low with dew. Inside the cabin, the kettle would be warming on the hearth, and Tessa would be tucking her shawl around her shoulders, already tying back her hair. Each day found its rhythm now, not from necessity, but from choice. He carried the harness across his shoulder and headed for the pen, where the mule waited with mild patience. The grain bin needed reinforcing, and the last of the fence line at the northern edge wanted mending before snowfall. He'd promised Charles he'd see to both before the week was out. The old man still kept his ledgers, though he rarely strayed from the porch anymore. His voice had grown softer, but his eyes stayed sharp. By late afternoon, Ashford returned to find Tessa seated at their table, her boots muddy from town, a folded paper in her hands. "They've asked me to take on the winter term entirely," she said, not with uncertainty but thoughtfulness. 3 days a week, full days. There'll be board for the children who live too far to walk home. Ashford leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "And you, I'll be home before dark. I'd still have time enough for everything here." He stepped inside, took the paper from her hands and set it gently on the table. "If you want it, you should take it." "I want it," she said, looking up at him, "but I also want to be here with you." "You'll be both," he said. "That's the whole of it, isn't it?" She smiled, and the look they shared needed no words to complete it. The next day, they walked the northern property line together, measuring out where the fence would curve to follow the rise of the land. Tessa carried a spool of cord, Ashford the hammer and posts. They worked in tandem, wordless at times, stepping around prairie dog holes and patches of thistle. Near the ridge, she paused and turned toward the wide valley below. "There'll be snow down there soon," she said. "I used to dread winter." Ashford drove a post into the ground with one steady blow. "Not anymore," she shook her head. "Not here. Not with this." Later, back at the cabin, they sat on the back stoop sharing a bowl of stewed apples cooled with cream. The breeze had picked up, brushing dry leaves across the yard, and the sky had taken on that particular streak of pink that came only in early autumn. Ashford set down his spoon. "I've been thinking about a name." "For what?" He gestured around them. "This place. The land. The cabin. You and me." Tessa leaned into his shoulder. "What name?" "Stillwater." She looked up at him. "Why that?" "Because everything else in my life moved too fast. Ran from what mattered. This holds, like water that settles." Her fingers curled into his. "Then let's call it that." By October's end, Tessa had taken up her post at the schoolhouse. She rode in with the children from the neighboring farms, a satchel of readers and slates at her side. Ashford saw to the fields, repaired the barn roof, and built a small lean-to for the chickens Charles insisted on raising again. Their days no longer followed hardship the way they once had. They followed each other, in warm bread left wrapped in a cloth on the hearth, in boots set side by the door. In the quiet way, Ashford waited beside the porch until he heard Tessa's horse returning each evening. On the first frost morning, they stood together outside, breath rising in pale clouds. The ground beneath them crackled as they walked past the fence line, down to the hollow where the stream ran shallow and slow. Ashford laid his coat over a log and they sat, shoulders touching. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. Tessa's hand slipped into his. "You built this? With you?" She turned to him, her eyes full of a quiet certainty. "We made it real, Ash." He kissed her there, beneath the bare limbs of the cottonwoods, with the hush of the water running low and the sky bright behind them. That winter, their home held warmth in every corner. Charles carved wooden toys for the schoolchildren and dozed by the fire with a quilt across his knees. Ashford crafted a cradle from pine, though Tessa had said nothing yet. He just knew, and when she told him, weeks later, her voice hushed with wonder, he only smiled and pulled her close. The snow came heavy that year, but their roof held. So did the walls. So did they. When spring returned, it brought crocus and wild onion and the soft bleating of lambs from the neighboring farm. The schoolhouse reopened with a fresh coat of whitewash, and Ashford traded eggs for seed with the family down the road. Tessa taught her pupils from a new primer sent by rail, and at home, she read aloud in the evenings while Ashford whittled spoon handles by lamplight. They never raised their voices. They didn't need to. They spoke in actions, in the way she set his cup near the stove before he came in from the cold, in the way he waited until her breath slowed before blowing out the lamp each night. Their love was not loud. It didn't have to be. It was steady. It was chosen. It was lasting. And when the cradle was finally filled, one early morning in June, while the birds called softly from the fence posts and the sky turned pearl gray above the hills, Ashford held his daughter against his chest, and Tessa rested her head against his shoulder, her smile tired and full. They named her Lily Wynn. That night, as the wind rose gentle across the porch and the lantern inside flickered low, Ashford rocked the cradle with one boot and watched Tessa sleep, hair loose against the pillow, one hand curled over the edge of the quilt. Stillwater, he thought. And it was. It truly was.